Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone, and welcome back to Global Insights, a live weekly interactive panel discussion which sheds light on big issues currently facing researchers, planners, and policymakers worldwide. Global Insights features experts from leading schools of international affairs, including the Balsillie School in Canada, University of Warwick in the United Kingdom, American University in Washington, United States, University of Konstanz in Germany, the Institute for Strategic Affairs in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and new this season, the Ritsumeikan University in Japan. We're delighted to host for the first time our new Asia-Pacific partner. Today's live stream production is entitled China and the World, The Road Ahead. My name is Anne Fitzgerald, the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's session. A warm welcome to all participants in the audience, and we have many of you today. We would invite you to place any questions that you have for any of the panelists using the Q&A function on the Zoom panel. We will do our best towards the latter part of the session to direct these questions to the appropriate panelists. We are privileged today to host four well-known experts on issues related to China. Miwa Hirono is an associate professor at the College of Liberal Arts and the Graduate School of International Relations at Ritsumeikan University. Her current research focuses on China's roles in conflict-affected areas, with particular attention paid to international peacekeeping, humanitarian and development assistance, and conflict mediation. Zhenjiang Zi is a postdoctoral fellow working on the Hungry Cities Partnership Project at the Balsillie School. His research examines food system sustainability, food security, and rural development in China. Joseph Turigian is an assistant professor at the School of International Service at the American University and a global fellow at the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. He studies Chinese and Russian politics and foreign policy. Kayleen Shea is a teaching fellow in politics and international development at the University of Warwick. Her work explores the role of gender in contemporary Chinese governance. Her current research project looks at ways in which negative effects are used in consolidating nationalism. A warm welcome to all of our panelists today. Thank you for being with us. I'd like to kick off with a big question, which focuses on major domestic and international governance challenges currently facing China. I'd like to start with Miwa and ask, what is the implication of China's rise for the global liberal order?
Thanks very much, Anne. It's really great honor to be invited to this forum. So one of the major international governance challenges facing China today is related to the question about how China should approach the global liberal order, which was established by the United States in the aftermath of World War II. Many analyses assume that China is trying to change the global liberal order for its own national interests. But I think this is a simplistic assumption. Is China going to challenge the global liberal order? It depends, according to the Chinese government. It depends on the definitions of the global liberal order. If the global liberal order means the order centering on the United Nations, China's aim is to strengthen such order rather than challenge it, because doing so helps China maintain its enormous power as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. So the international governance challenges in this context include how to strengthen the UN while influencing it in such a way to support China's worldview and national interests. However, if the global liberal order refers to the order centering on the United States, then China intends to challenge it. In this context, China's governance challenges relate to how to defend what China sees as its national security matters, including issues about Hong Kong and Xinjiang, despite the criticisms from the US and other Western countries.
Thank you. Joseph Turigian, leaders matter and leadership matters. What kind of person is Xi Jinping?
Xi Jinping is the son of a high-ranking revolutionary and then later powerful figure in the People's Republic of China after 1949. So as the son of such an individual, he has a lot of confidence and obligation towards the project that the Chinese Communist Party has begun. At the same time, because of his father, he suffered quite a bit as a child. His father was removed from the leadership in 1962. And in fact, in the late 1960s, Xi Jinping was sent down to the countryside when he was only a teenager. And it was a very powerful experience for him. And one of the things he learned was a lot of the radical ideals of the Cultural Revolution down in the countryside where politics met people turned out to be unpractical. And also because the experience was so grueling, it taught him toughness, it taught him resolve. So I think what we have here is a person whose life experience had many grievances, but also taught him the importance of practicality, the importance of toughness, and also is an individual who believes that a sense of obligation and motivation is critical to the survival of the Chinese Communist Party.
Thank you. Kaylee and Shay, your fellow panelist, Miwa, coming in from Japan, spoke about China's global ambitions. We also know that until very recently, the country had a one-child policy. Do you think that this former policy, which has only been loosened marginally, will in any way impact these or hinder these ambitions?
Well, I think to consider this question, it's important to remember that China's one-child policy arrived hand in hand with its economic reform as part of the state-led modernization program. So from the very beginning, the policy was designed to not only control the population quantity, but also trying to improve the population quality. So the idea is that if the families only have one child, then obviously we'll have more resources to educate the child. The policy was hugely controversial and has far-reaching economic and social consequences. On one hand, it also has given rise to the so-called the largest number of well-educated women in China's long history. But on the other hand, it also creates a hugely skewed sex ratio at birth. So as our common knowledge tells us, more education for women would mean fewer and later births. So I think this poses a question of simply there's probably not enough women for Chinese men to marry, which is commonly perceived as a potential threat for the social stability. So China is also aging fast because of this, which threatens an economic boom that is built upon the large supply of cheap labor force. So, and there may not be enough people, able-bodied people, to look after the elders. So I think all of these make people believe that there is a population crisis happening, which lead to the state to replace this policy with a two-child policy. But the question of how effective this measure is and whether it's sufficient, and it remains to be seen.
Thank you. Zhenjiang, you look a lot at food security and food governance. How do Chinese cities ensure that that they are food secure?
Well, I think as a scholar studying food and agriculture system in China, I think the key challenges really lies in the future of this agriculture sector in the country. I mean, who will be the farmer and how agriculture will continue to contribute to the sustainable development future of the country. It's a very big challenge. Economically, I think agriculture is a less competitive income source compared to other non-farming jobs. That's why we've seen over 174 million farmers found jobs in cities in 2019. And as a result, a lot of the people living in the countryside who actually conduct the farming jobs are actually the elderly. And that's a huge problem for the population in the agriculture sector. The population is aging. And on the other hand, the migrant people who work in cities find it difficult to actually get equal access to social welfare and other benefits as their urban counterparts. And I think the governance challenge also lies in the environmental issue in relation to agriculture, because the whole country is so dependent on the usage of agrochemicals, and we've seen a lot of pollution from agriculture. And it's great to see that the government is trying to implement a lot of policies in recent years to reduce the pollution and also the usage of agrochemicals. But the problem is a lot of these farmers who actually converted to ecological farming find it difficult to market, and there are a lot of marketing challenges. and a lot of the farmers couldn't even, make profits. So that's another big challenge. I think there are so many, governance challenges in relation to agriculture and food issues.
Yes, and we haven't even talked about the current pandemic yet, which we'll come to.
Yeah.
China, a country of 1.4 billion citizens, second largest economy in the world. It is clearly a world power. So I'd like to talk about how China sees itself in the current world order, and start with you, Kei-Ling. Could you comment on ways in which the claimed history of a century of humiliation by the Chinese Communist Party supports China's governance today?
Well, I think to understand how China sees its place in the current world, and we must understand how it sees its own histories. So many scholars have identified the term, as you said, the century of humiliation, which is commonly used to describe the period from the early 19th to early 20th centuries, when China lost both its territory and its prestige to the imperial power of the day, such as Japan and British Empire. So the Chinese state has been using it to construct a history of redemption, within which CCP is said to be the driving force that's saving the suffering Chinese nation and restore it to its original glory, and to accomplish the so-called great mission of national rejuvenation, which again is a term commonly appeared in official discourse nowadays. So this history, or this particular narration of history, has been serving as a unifying force within China since the last century, even before CCP's rule, and it continues to do so until today. So I think it certainly shapes how China views itself and its relation to the world.
Thank you. Joseph, over to you. Talk to us about ideology and ideological considerations and the way that this plays into China's foreign policy.
Sure. So here in Washington, D.C., the extent to which ideology drives Chinese foreign policy is one of the most hotly debated topics. Some people say that it's a purely ideological approach. Some people say that China is an inherently realist country where ideology hardly plays any role at all. I think it makes more sense to approach this from the perspective of recognizing that it matters in some ways, but not others, and asking about particular issue areas. I think it's certainly the case that because Xi Jinping believes that the collapse of the Soviet Union to a large extent was the result of a loss of belief in the communist mission and a degradation of ideals. So he very clearly wants to educate the party and the Chinese population and the value of the historic mission of the Chinese Communist Party in language that sounds very ideological, which raises questions in other countries about just how dogmatic Xi Jinping's approach is, both to his own country and the rest of the world. Also, I believe the Chinese leadership interprets a lot of American behavior from the arguably ideological perspective of that Washington in particular has a long-term goal of wanting to undermine the communist regime because of the desire to do so-called colored revolution or peaceful evolution, because of this idea that nobody in the United States can tolerate a rising China precisely because it is communist. At the same time, I don't want to overstate the importance of ideology in Xi Jinping's calculations. China no longer exports revolution. It's no longer trying to overcome and destroy regimes because of their political platform. And also, even though Xi Jinping cares so much about talking about communism in a way that makes him sound like a true believer, we have to remember that even within that spectrum, there can be a great deal of tactical flexibility. So even Lenin was somebody who could retreat and take steps back if he thought that over the long term it would be advantage for the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to move forward.
Noah, can you talk to us about the approach that the Chinese government takes to the principle of non-interference?
Sure. Let me tackle with the question you raised earlier, which is how China sees its place in the current world order, because this question relates to the issue of the principle of non-interference. An important thing to bear in mind is China's multifaceted identity. On the one hand, China sees itself as the leader of the developing world, the leader that shares a sense of historical humiliation deriving from Western colonization, as Kylie mentioned earlier. On the other hand, since about 2008, China has clearly seen itself as a great power, or more specifically, a responsible great power. In that context, upholding the principle of non-interference is really important because it is integral to the multifaceted identity. It's a principle recognized in the Bandung Conference in 1954 as one of the key principles that really matter to the developing nations. In today's context, China considered that this is the principle key to the responsible foreign policy because this principle allows states to respect each other's sovereignty. However, China's approach to the principle of non-interference is also changing and taking an approach somewhat similar to great powers in the West. As I hope to mention later, China is now engaging in a wide range of activities, including robust UN peacekeeping operations and conflict mediation, in which it is difficult to continue to adhere to the principle of non-interference with the same degree of rigor as during the Cold War period.
Well, key to all of these aspirations is a healthy society. Zhen Zhangzi, how food secure, like what are the main challenges to Chinese citizens being food secure in a sustainable way?
Yeah, when we evaluate the food security condition in China, I think it's important that we have to rely on the official data. Based on the official numbers released, we know it is fair to say, I think China is quite food secure in terms of its very high degree of self-sufficiency rate of the three major cereal grains, including wheat, rice, and corn. In 2019, the self-sufficiency rate for these three cereals was above 98%. And that number has remained to be high since 2003. And some researchers estimate that the number could be above 100%. And according to the Chinese government, the amount of food reserve they have right now could feed the population for over 6 months. So despite all of this, I think it doesn't mean that the country has no risk of food insecurity. Actually, the risk could be high because of the pandemic and also the natural disaster. We all know about the flooding recently in news headlines, and also the geopolitical tensions. I want to say the biggest challenge might be the reliance upon food imports, especially its soybean consumption. In 2019, 83% of its domestic soy consumption comes from food imports. And China is estimated to be going to buy about 90% of its soy consumption in 2020. And it's bought up 60% of the soybean in the global food market. So it's a very important crop. And because soybeans are used to make cooking oil and also for animal feed, it is important for the country's supply of animal food. If anything happens that disrupts the global food trade, that will greatly affect the country's supply provisioning of animal food. And we have to keep in mind that China is a country with a growing middle class, who has growing demand for quality food and animal protein. And if people are seeing rising price of animal food, they will have to consume more grains and cereal grains. That will put pressure on the self-sufficiency level of grains. I also want to quickly mention that other food security challenge lies in the limits of its natural resources, especially the water scarcity and soil pollution. These are the major challenge for the sustainable future of its agriculture sector. And food safety, as one of the key dimensions of food security, is also a big problem. Since 2008, the minimum milk scandal, it's been a national crisis. In our survey in Nanjing, for example, 2/3 of the population said they concern about food safety on a daily basis. So that's a big challenge for the country.
Thank you for sharing that data with us. Miwa, I want to turn to some of the immediate threats to security, both in terms of human and national security in the Asia-Pacific region, and ask you to give the audience a general sense of China's approach to promoting peace and security in conflict-affected countries.
Okay, thank you. There are so many kinds of conflict-affected regions in Asia Pacific, but let me just focus on one of them now, which is intra-state conflict in Myanmar. Given the flexible understanding of the principle of non-interference I mentioned earlier, China is now playing a more proactive role in conflict resolution today than, say, in the early 2010s. For example, China sent special envoys to Myanmar to mitigate conflict in the China-Myanmar border regions and Rakhine State, and offered conflict mediation. China also believes that economic development will offer a fundamental solution to conflict. The Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, is very important in this context. Of course, we will need to do more discussion about whether, and if so how, the BRI can actually help resolve conflict. But at the very least, this is what the Chinese government claims.
Joseph, can I come to you and just ask you why Xi Jinping cares so much about Taiwan?
Sure. So I think that any Chinese leader would find Taiwan to be a particularly sensitive and important area for the leadership to consider. However, I think that for Xi Jinping, this is also a particularly personal issue. So his father, for many years, ran something called United Front Work. And United Front Work refers to the party's relations to individuals or organizations that are not members of the Chinese Communist Party. So what that meant was, more than almost anyone else within the elite, Xi Jinping's father had a relationship with members of the KMT, the nationalists. And what's so interesting is he even maintained a very close friendship with a high-ranking KMT figure from the same province, even after 1949, and they stayed in touch in the 80s and 90s and talked about possible ways for reunification. Xi Jinping spent many time in provinces like Zhejiang and Fujian, areas where there was a lot of Taiwanese investment. So he has a good sense of the Taiwan issue. He knows a lot of Taiwanese people. But I think that there is one particular piece of evidence that is especially revealing of Xi Jinping's thinking on this issue. So Ma Ying-jeou, who is the president of Taiwan, before the current president, met with Xi Jinping in 2015. And during the dinner afterwards, as Ma Ying-jeou wrote about in his memoirs, Xi Jinping told Ma about a conversation that Xi had with Angela Merkel, the German chancellor. And Merkel said to him, why is it that we in Germany, when we lose territory, we don't care about it so much? Why is it that Chinese and Germans are so different? And Xi Jinping's answer was, we Chinese are completely different from you Germans. If we give up anything that our ancestors gave to us, we are traitors to our own people. So I think that Xi Jinping has a very, very strong personal obligation, understands the politics of why he needs to be strong on this issue. I don't want to say that that inevitably means that he's going to take an especially hard line, because he also does understand, at least a little bit, how those types of those actions would affect Taiwanese people. But he does feel that he can't let it go. He understands that he may be constrained in what he can do. So it's definitely an area to keep an eye on.
Thank you. Kayleen, how do the domestic politics support these global ambitions?
Well, I think for this, I find the recent state emphasized on the notion of devotion to family and nation, 家国情怀, an interesting signifier for its domestic politics. Since I'm always interested in how the private connect with the public, in this case, and how the private domestic Chinese family serve its public instrumental function today, by extension, its global ambition, both through its biological reproduction, but also through its cultural and social reproduction. China scholars have noted that family in China, in post-reform China, represents a space that many people believe they can remove themselves from the reach of the state to seek peace and comfort. However, we shall not forget that Chinese family has also long been the target of national political reform from the start of the 20th century. For example, the hierarchical patriarchy family structure was heavily condemned as the cause of individual suffering then. So which makes the current state effort to revive the concept of devotion to one's family and paralleling it with devotion to the nation at this particular historic juncture intriguing. Since Chinese family has been a contested site that demands devotion, sacrifices, and unity from its members, despite tension and pains one might experience within the family. And if you're one family, you're basically on the same boat, for better or for worse. So in this sense, I think its domestic policies is set not only to govern the population by force, but also to win people's heart and soul through their love to their family. So in doing so, I think to summon support to the state moves both within and beyond its national boundaries.
Interesting. Zhang Zhongzi, there are fueling prices concerning food and other goods and basic staples. Do you see any tensions or conflicts at the domestic level breaking out over these issues?
I think we need to understand that the tension or the fear of food insecurity in China is reasonable and it's understandable. The country should always be alert against the potential risk of food insecurity. And we've seen recently there's a growing concern of impending food shortage. And I think the change of the mentality about food insecurity is necessary for the country to constantly enhance and enforce many of its food security policies. There are multiple reasons I want to say in relation to this change of concerns related to food insecurity. Other than the dependency on food imports. One critical issue is food waste. We've seen food waste is on the news headlines recently. It has been one of the major threats to China's food security because of its some of the cultural factors, such as enjoying big meals, celebration with banquets. All these factors are playing a role to make food waste a huge problem for the country. And also, I just mentioned food reserve in one of the previous questions. I want to say that food reserve system is not transparent enough in China. It is hard to find information about how food is actually stored and purchased and how food in the reserve system is sold or released to the market. So there are a lot of corruptions in this process. We need more public monitoring system here to actually reduce corruption. Because of the pandemic, we haven't talked about the impacts of the pandemic yet. There is the global food market is also having more and more uncertainty in the future. And we've seen, some of the major grain exporters, such as Vietnam, Thailand, are having imposed some restrictions on their food exportation. So whether this trend will actually expand to soybean market in the future remains to be seen. I think that will be a big threat. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, let's move to the pandemic then. Despite it being the home of its origin, China has weathered this pandemic fairly well, at least compared to many other countries. Let's look at how the pandemic has affected domestic and foreign policies. So, Joseph, I'd like to start with you on this. Tell us about the connection between elite politics and foreign policy in China.
So there has been a lot of speculation, both within China and outside China, whether or not foreign policy failures, or at least the appearance of foreign policy failures, may weaken Xi Jinping's position at home. And that was a particularly prominent question earlier on during the crisis, when it looked like the Chinese government response was more muddled. But even more broadly, China's actions on the world stage and also a lot of what it's been doing at home has led to a backlash. And some people have speculated whether or not the ability to point to those problems would allow some group within the leadership to rally and either force Xi Jinping to take another approach or remove him and install somebody who looked at these issues differently. I think that's a fundamentally wrong way of thinking about how Chinese elite politics works. This is unambiguously not a system that is a popularity contest. This is not a system where power flows from the bottom up. Generally speaking, the way that power works in these types of systems is that people who are not the leader try to figure out what the leader wants and gives it to the leader to win the leader's support. It's not that the leader is looking for support from below. So I'm not saying that Xi Jinping's position is invincible. He doesn't have the revolutionary prestige and authority that people like Mao Zedong or Deng Xiaoping did. And I'm not saying that he doesn't care at all about politics, but if there is a move against him, I doubt that it would be about primarily policy differences. And I think also we need to keep in mind that there is a lot of reason to believe that any leader who would be in Xi Jinping's position would be approaching these issues from exactly the same way that he is.
Thank you. Killian, is Chinese nationalism on the rise, in your view?
Well, I think it's difficult to give a simple answer to this question, isn't it? Since there are so many different types of nationalism to start with: ethnic nationalism, state nationalism, popular nationalism, and so on. So I guess for the relevance of our discussion, and given the news reaching us from Washington and Beijing, it seems clear that it has, I think it has strengthened the nationalist conflict between the United States and China since the pandemic. Within China, I think nationalism has been the basis of CCP's official historiography, but the idea of nationalism itself is also a double-edged sword, so not to mention the nuances between nationalism and patriotism. So the state has certainly, I think, used the pandemic as another opportunity to stir up patriotic sentiment among its people through publicizing and praising its claimed swift containment of the virus. So patriotism has also been officially named as one of the core elements of the so-called Chinese spirit. So therefore, I think it's fair to say that nationalism has its constant presence in China.
Just on the issue of the pandemic, Miwa, we've heard a lot about certain countries breaking norms and rules, or trying to encourage norms and rules. To what extent does China attempt to change norms and rules in the international order and within international organizations like the United Nations, particularly since the pandemic?
Sure, depends on the topics, but when it comes to a pandemic issue, it's not so much about China trying to change norms and rules in international organizations, at least for now. As I mentioned, upholding the UN-centric world order is beneficial to China. But the power balance in the UN is clearly tilting towards China now. And what China is trying to do is to increase its influence in the UN. What pandemic has done to China, or any other countries for that matter, is to make the existing problems worse, or dramatize or make more visible the existing phenomena. Such existing phenomena in this context include the heightened tension between and distrust between China and the United States, and China's increasing power in the United Nations in the UN-centric world order. So the most obvious story about this in relation to COVID-19 is obviously about the World Health Organization. WHO is one of the specialized agencies within the UN system. After President Trump announced that he would terminate the US relationship with WHO, there is a vacuum after the US left. So who filled the vacuum? Of course, it's China. So after President Trump's announcement, Chinese President Xi Jinping said China would provide $2 billion over 2 years to help other countries respond to the impact of COVID-19, which is more than what the US contributed before, which was $893 million per year. So that's an interesting figure to think about.
Yes, indeed. Zhenzhangzi, what do you think, what are the ways in which the pandemic has really impacted China, according to your own research interests?
I would like to talk briefly about COVID-19's impacts on food security in China. I think the impacts are phenomenal and far-reaching, something we've never seen before. In the Hungry Cities Partnership conducted a citywide survey in Wuhan, the epicenter, in March when the city was still under lockdown. And we found that the food insecure households, the number of food insecure households rose sharply compared to pre-COVID-19 status. There were about 40% of the households could be categorized as severely food insecure, and only 5% of the households in Wuhan during the lockdown were considered completely food secure. This is a very shocking number because China has a quite good reputation in terms of maintaining its food security in its cities. And the impacts of the pandemic also happens in the agriculture sector. During February and March, when when the most stringent quarantine measures were actually enforced. There was a shortage of agriculture inputs due to transportation blockage and factory shutdown. And the mentality of the risk, perception of risk in the future has changed. Farmers are reluctant to sell their products. And the impacts on the food supply chain is also huge, and because of the shutdown of all the major food outlets in cities, especially traditional food public markets, which is the major supplier of daily fresh vegetables and meat. The food consumption also changed, and we've seen the food price in China climbed by about 10% in July for the same period last year. There was a dramatic switch to online food ordering as a lot of people are locked down in their apartment buildings. So we've seen a lot of vulnerable groups who do not know how to order food online, having some problems to access food. And also there's a reduced dietary diversity. Having said that, I want to briefly say that there are some positive sides in terms of the impacts on food security from the pandemic. One positive impact is the increasing labor force for farming, because a lot of the farmers were actually stranded in the countryside after the Spring Festival holiday. We've seen a lot of the abandoned farmland being farmed again, and these people contribute to the agriculture sector greatly. And also the pandemic allows more family food gathering, breaking bread with your loved ones. I think it's a great opportunity to amend the deteriorated family connection in the modern world. And people are also picking up new food skills, which is also important for the food security.
Thank you. We've got a lot of questions coming in that are asking about the relationship between China and the West moving forward, whether this will be characterized by greater international cooperation or indeed greater rivalry. So Kayleen, can I start with you and ask about what does popular culture suggest about China moving forward in the world order?
Well, to start off light, I think for those of you who love Hollywood-style action film, and I would like to point out a hugely popular Chinese production released in 2017, The Wolf Warrior 2. So this film generated nearly $900 million and became the top-earning Chinese film in history, and also one of the top 50 top-grossing films in the history of world cinema. So the film, it's great success, and I think also it imagines and presents China as the new world leaders of world nations. But what is less exciting in this film is that the narrative is simply borrowed from the older era of European colonial histories. Like many of us would be familiar, like the white man's burdens and the civilizing missions without much creativity. So Africa in this film is presented as lacking both agency and history, but there's obviously an obvious replacement of US presence with Chinese presence in Africa, which was also presented in a very quite dramatic battle between the so-called good and evil. So I find the film is quite telling for its imaginary world order, but one can always say the film is just a film. But for those of you who are interested to read further, and there is a great collection of essays compiled by scholars such as Petrus Liu and Lisa Ruffle, for those of you who are interested.
Thank you. And Miwa, let's just continue this thread and turn to you. What is the role of the Asia-Pacific region in decreasing the level of tension between China and the US?
Yeah, thanks very much. The heightened tension between China and the US is not a preordained future. This question relates to the so-called new Cold War rhetoric we hear quite a lot about these days. This rhetoric is not so helpful in my view, firstly because the dynamics of the relationship between China and the US is very different from that between the US and the Soviet Union. And secondly, because such a rhetoric unnecessarily raises a level of tension between China and the US. One of the major differences between the Cold War and the current US-China relations lies in the role of the Asian states. While Asian states have some tendency to have closer relations with one or the other, for example, Japan has close security relations with the United States, many countries actually take hedging behavior strategies, hedging behavior against the two countries, and have close relations with one country on one issue and with the other country on another issue. And these countries in Asia-Pacific region can have an important role to make China accountable on the ground. For example, when China takes a Belt and Road Initiative and wants to make some investment in Asian countries successful, it's really important to consider the debt sustainability and human rights conditions, for example. So this is where the US and other Western countries can help. So it shouldn't be just a rivalry relation, but it can be some cooperative relations too.
Okay, could I just ask you to go on a little bit further and talk about the role towards Hong Kong more particularly? There's another question which is directly related, so I'd just like to continue with that thread. You know, what role can we see in diffusing these tensions moving forward?
This is a really difficult question because what I was talking about is sort of general sort of possibility of cooperation. But when it comes to that area where China considers as a part of its sovereign country, sovereignty, which is Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and also South China Sea as well, the dynamics is very different. So yeah, it is very difficult to consider the role of Asian states. Although, if you look at the Philippines, for example, the relationship between the Philippines and China is changing every now and then, and that depends on the issue of South China Sea, depends on the issue of how much Belt and Road Initiative China wants to bring into the Philippines, etc. So it's more complicated. So I might just leave it there for now.
No problem. Joseph Turigian, can you just give us an idea of whether or not Xi Jinping is a new type of leader? I mean, some aspects of his policies, especially those concerning the developmental state model and others, have been praised by many amidst all the criticisms that have been launched against China.
So very often when you read newspaper articles about Xi Jinping, inevitably you will see comparisons to previous leaders, both in terms of domestic politics and foreign policy. And the narrative, the very common narrative here is that Xi Jinping is something new. He's a new type of Chinese leader. Unfortunately, I think that that is an overstatement and that we shouldn't ignore the continuities here. So Cui Jian, who is a famous rocker and was associated with the student movement in 1989 in Beijing, has this famous quote that as long as the portrait of Chairman Mao hangs in Tiananmen Square, we are all one generation. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of these continuities. So for example, one thing that you very often hear is that Xi Jinping is the most powerful leader since Mao Zedong, and maybe even just as powerful as Mao Zedong. I think that is a wrong assessment. Mao's authority was absolute. His authority was tied in with the legitimacy of the regime as a whole. And if you want to talk about stress tests of authority, things like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution really point to just how much people within the party would stand up and salute even when they understood that policies were failing and even when they themselves were suffering great personal devastation because of those choices. Deng Xiaoping has a reputation for being in favor of collective leadership and stable succession. That unfortunately is an artifact of what the Chinese regime was trying to portray itself was in the aftermath of the Mao's tenure, but as new evidence increasingly shows, that is a misunderstanding of what Deng's rule represented. And what's so interesting about Deng is he believed very strongly that the core strength of the Chinese Communist Party was precisely that there was a core meaning one top leader, and once he made up a decision, everybody would have to obey that choice. And in fact, he uses foreign policy to accentuate his belief in the effectiveness of the Chinese system. And the example that he used was the Soviet decision to invade Afghanistan, which most people would think was a mistake. But what's so interesting about Deng is he said, all they had to do was have a few discussions and then the choice was made. So his idea was you want to have a system where this one leader can can really bring everything together. And especially after 1989, this sentiment, I think, became even more powerful. So all this talk about a core and Xi Jinping violating those earlier sentiments, I think is an exaggeration. People say that Xi Jinping is more ideological. I don't want to overstate that either. We know now that during the Hu Jintao era, a lot of the liberal intellectuals were very deeply dissatisfied with him, believing he was a leftist, and that Hu and other leaders internally were even praising Cuba and North Korea, believe it or not, as models for China, as places where they were able to get their ideological act together. And in terms of foreign policy, and I'll stop with this, a lot of people have noticed that Chinese assertiveness predated Xi Jinping, especially in areas like the South China Sea. So I think that Xi Jinping is unique for several reasons, including one that you alluded to in your question, but that I would not lose sight of these very, very crucial continuities either.
Thanks so much. Questions also been asked about China's wolf warrior approach to diplomacy. Miwa, can you shed any light on that?
Sure. That question, so relates to the issue of China's multifaceted identity I mentioned earlier. So on one hand, China sees itself as a leader of the developing world, and that sense comes from this sense of historical humiliation. So on one hand, this wolf warrior approach is really reflecting sort of China's sense that China has been treated unfairly. So it's China's response to unfair approaches, being called it's a Wuhan virus and all that sort of stuff. It's what China considers an unfair approach. So that's a response to it. But at the same time, this is a different sort of context now, because China is also a great power. So it has had this long sort of sense of historical humiliation for a long time. But what's changing now is this sense of great powerness. And that led to some wolf warrior approaches to diplomacy. Just a sort of anecdotal response to it. But I think that relates to this very fundamental issue about the identity.
Thanks so much. Back to you, Miwa, on the new norms that China's setting down for its engagement in Africa and the global South. Do you see any change in this based on their economic ambitions, post-pandemic imperatives?
In Africa?
Yes.
Or in Africa?
Yes.
Okay, so it is changing, but what pandemic has done is, as I said, it's really sort of make the existing issues more visible. So it is China's tendency for a long time, since about middle of 2000s, that China has been taking a more proactive approach to Africa, and particularly conflict in Africa. So in the past, it says that what China was interested in Africa is a business activity. So, for example, China goes to Sudan, and many people say, well, why do you go to Sudan and do the business activity? And China's response would be, business is business. We are here for business, not for politics. But that sort of approach, it doesn't exist any longer. And China realizes China operates in the conflict setting, and therefore, even though China goes there primarily for business purposes, it has to pay more attention to local conflict context. So in that context, China is doing a lot in terms of conflict mitigation, including UN peacekeeping operations, humanitarian assistance, development assistance, and conflict mediation, what have you. So it is taking more proactive approach, sometimes goes beyond the principle of non-interference. So it is changing.
Okay, Joseph, two questions for you about Xi Jinping's personal experience during the Cultural Revolution, if it shaped his political outlook, and also on that subject, does Xi Jinping or his father have any historical relationship with the Uyghurs or Xinjiang? If so, what kind? Could you allude to both of those questions, please?
So I've written articles directly on those two questions. So even though I'm brief because it's a webinar, I urge the people who are interested in these issues to check that out. In terms of the Cultural Revolution, try to imagine for a moment that you are 14 years old. Your father has already been removed from the leadership because of trumped up charges. There is violence all around you, students fighting teachers, students fighting each other. You're not allowed to participate in this great campaign because you're seen as the son of a Black element. You're incarcerated. You are subjected to struggle sessions. When you escape and go home to see your mother, she doesn't help you because of the need to protect both herself and you because of the intense political atmosphere going on. You are sent in 1969, just a few years later, to the countryside where you live in a particularly desolate region where you see all the suffering that people had experienced, not just during the Cultural Revolution, but during all of the political disasters before. When you finally see your father, after he had been in the political wilderness and also suffered at struggle sessions and even put into solitary confinement, he doesn't even recognize you because it had been so long since he had last seen you and can't distinguish between you and your father. So I think that that kind of suffering, but still his ability to maintain faith in the Chinese Communist Party's historical mission can only undoubtedly have a very impact on a young individual. In terms of Xinjiang, as I alluded to earlier, Xi Jinping's father had a special role managing United Front work, which didn't just include the nationalists, but also included religious figures, ethnic figures. And in fact, when the PRC was first founded in 1949, for the first several years, Xi Jinping's father was head of the so-called Northwest Bureau, which was an enormous swath of the country, which included Xinjiang and Qinghai and other areas that included Muslims, Tibetans, and many Uyghurs. And Xi Jinping's father happened to be in power during periods when the Chinese Communist Party believed that co-opting as opposed to repressing, although there was always this repression element there, tended to be the more prominent position that the CCP had adopted, either because it was right after 1949 and they needed to stabilize the position, or it was the 1980s and the disaster of the Cultural Revolution had become especially prominent. But I want to emphasize that these are just two different, forms of control. And people use liberal and conservative to describe them, but historically, for what it's worth, Xi Jinping's father tended to be on the side of believing that co-opting and using bridges through local prominent figures was more useful than just simply cracking down.
Thank you very much. Zhenzhongzi, there's a question for you saying it would be interesting to reflect on the Chinese distant fishing and how China is illegally fishing in some African countries. This has had an impact on local fishery economy, but has an impact on the local ecosystem, as well as another question on the agricultural sector. And yes, blockchain technology. How has this been applied to the agricultural sector to seek transparency? Could you briefly allude to both of those questions?
Since my research area is not about fishing, so I hope that other panelists can address that question. I can just talk briefly about the adoption of blockchain technology in the agriculture sector. So the blockchain technology is mainly adopted to enhance the transparency of information sharing in relation to food. Essentially, the technology is to enhance trust. As I just mentioned, food safety is a critical issue in China. It's been a national crisis since 2008. So a lot of initiatives are emerging to actually facilitate the adoption of blockchain technology and other technologies to enhance information sharing in relation to the food. However, I want to say that trust is a very complicated issue that is beyond, transparent information sharing. Especially in the specific social relations and social norms and the context in China, trust is much heavily dependent upon personal relations and social networks. In Chinese, we have a term guanxi, and guanxi is so important to establish and maintain trust in the Chinese society. That's why we've seen a lot of new initiatives in the agriculture sector, such as community-supported agriculture and farmers markets, and all these alternative food initiatives are rapidly emerging in Chinese cities because they are able to enhance and facilitate trust between consumers and producers. So I think people are skeptical about the information in the blockchain system, although that the information could not be changed once it's inscribed in the blockchain. So I think it's problematic to actually only relying upon these technologies to actually enhance trust.
Thank you. Well, we're edging our way towards the end of this session. There are still a number of questions in the queue, and we'll do our best to get back to the members of the audience on these questions with an informed answer where possible. But just to pitch one final question to all of you, policymakers make up our audience today. What, if you would, share with them as a final consideration or a recommendation for them to think about moving forward on China? Starting with Miwa Hirono.
Okay, it's important to focus on the question of how we can make China accountable in terms of human rights, debt sustainability, and environmental issues in its engagement with Asian regions. Ideological conflicts should never stop us from talking with each other. My recommendations are continue engagement, work on the ground together, and invest in international organizations.
Thank you. Joseph Turigian, key considerations for the policy community.
So drawing on the comments I made earlier in this webinar, first, I would be more subtle about how we think about the role that ideology plays in Chinese decision-making. And recognize that even though that element is there is still the ability for them to be flexible and tactical, and also not to presume that Xi Jinping will be vulnerable to foreign policy differences or foreign policy mistakes with regards to power struggles within the elite.
Thank you. Kayleen, Shay.
Well, I think for me, China is a diverse country, and therefore there are always diverse voices and stories beyond what we normally hear and see from this side of the world. So I think the danger, I guess, would be ignoring its diversity, but only see it from one side.
Thanks so much. Zhenjiang Zi.
I think we need to enhance our understanding of the actual situation in the country. One example is the misunderstanding of wet markets in China. Early this year, after the pandemic broke out, a lot of calls to close down all wet markets in Chinese cities. But without understanding that wet markets are the most important food source for millions of Chinese urban residents, and a lot of them are not selling wild animals. So there's a misunderstanding there that we need to be aware of that in making policies. And I also want to quickly highlight that it is deeply problematic to treat food just as merely another commodity. Food is a powerful tool for the state to achieve many of its development goals. And it's a public interest issue and social justice issue. And the state has a much bigger role to play to enhance its food security policies and also contributes to public health.
Thank you so much to all four panelists for what I'm sure you will agree was a great discussion, very compelling thinking there. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope you will join us next week. That is Thursday, September the 17th at the same place, same time for what I know will be another equally interesting discussion on racism, anti-oppression, and international affairs. Until then, thank you very much. Take care and stay safe.